Okay, thank you very much. And our next speaker is Shann Turnbull, who's been one of the stalwarts of corporate governance reform for a number of years. He'll be joining us by Skype.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to Professor Beta for allowing me to share some thoughts with you today. If we go to my second slide, you will see my research question, which is how might firms obtain the incentive to minimise any negative environmental impact arising from their business? The strategy of the proposed solution is to amend corporate constitutions so citizens who possess the knowledge and incentive to be watchdogs of environmental risks and harms can influence individuals in the firm who possess the power and capability to take corrective action. The approach is shown in the next slide, number 3. First, you need to separate the powers of directors to manage a business from the power to govern the firm. The second element is then to introduce into the Constitution voices of stakeholders to influence how the firm is governed, to protect and further their interests that can include environmental risks and impacts. The outcome of changing constitutions in this way is to introduce what I call network governance that possesses bottom-up and outside-in communication and control channels to complement the traditional top-down command and control power of hierarchies. Let's consider what are the governance powers if we move to slide number 4. It is the control of the general meeting of the stockholders, which makes decisions on which directors they nominate and how they remunerate them and retire them. It's identifying nominating the internal and external auditors, appointing them, remunerating them and retiring them. It's identification and management of conflicts of interest by directors and management, and determining the key performance indicators for rewarding executives. How this looks is in the next slide, number 4, where we see the members or stockholders elect 2 different boards. One board is the management board, or it could be its supervisory board, elected on 1 vote per share in the traditional way. I suggest that we use cumulative voting, though, so that minority interests can be elected to the board to act as private whistleblowers to the governance board. And you'll see that's elected on 1 vote per investor. That's a democratic basis. And that is vital to protect the minority interests, which weren't protected in Italy with Parmalat, which failed because the chief executive was the major shareholder who had the power to elect both the supervisory board, and so the management board, as well as the governance board. What we need to do to introduce network governance is shown if we move on to slide number 6, which is the practical answer to the research question of introducing network governance. Now, the knee-jerk reaction of when people see this is to say, oh, it's too complicated, it's too busy, it's too expensive, you spend all your time in committees talking to each other, when in fact, if you read my paper, the very opposite happens. Because what you have done is decompose decision-making labour into simpler, manageable elements within the ability of normal humans to do, and it's how ordinary people can achieve extraordinary results, as we can see when we move on to the next slide, number 7, which identifies examples of network governance in the John Lewis Partnership in England with 60,000 owner-controllers, in the Mondragon Stakeholder Cooperatives in the north of Spain, and in Visa International. The importance of these large, complex examples is not just that they provide competitive advantages of introducing network governance, but for lawyers, it proves that no changes in the law are required to introduce network governance. All that is required is to change the corporate constitution. And this is the elephant in the room that academics and business schools and schools of public and private administration just do not see. So the next question is, how do we introduce this politically? So we move to slide number 8, where we've identified 4 political options. One is the obvious one of regulators mandating corporate constitutions. the more attractive one is to introduce tax and regulatory incentives for amending them. But if it's a non-resident firm, we needed other approaches, which could also be included domestically, is to produce a tax incentive to create what I call ecological endowment firms. And they create a new class of shares called stakeholder shares. And those shares acquire, without any transfer of value, all the property rights of the investor shares over 20 years. Now, just remember, that may seem radical, but all intellectual property has limited life. Patents typically have a 20-year life. And investors discount the future, not only for the present value, but also for risk. And a relatively small tax incentive can make it more attractive for owners of corporation to give up uncertain long-term ownership in return for bigger profits quicker, sooner, with less risk. The fourth political option is for legislation to allow stakeholder associations to be formed, which are formally recognized, have to be formally recognized by the corporation as setting the key performance indicators as illustrated in the early example of network governance. Now, you may say, what's this got to do with using the laws of nature to protect nature? Well, network governance, if we move on to the slide number 9, describes the control and communication architecture of living things, including our brains. There is no chief executive neuron in the brain. Only networks of neural nodes, each node having specialist functions, as illustrated in Figure 1 with the various stakeholder councils at the bottom of the diagram. The science of communication and control in the animal and machine was only identified and defined in 1948 by Norbert Wiener. And the science of governance has some important natural laws. One is the Ashby's laws of requisite variety that says it's impossible to manage complexity unless you have a requisite number of control channels. Likewise, Shannon's law of communication says you can increase the accuracy of communications as much as you like by increasing the number of cross-checking channels of communication, which are essential for reporting on complexity. And that really sums up what is in my paper, which I encourage you to read. And so for the remaining few minutes, I'll go into a few details and raise the issue of the ethical standards, how all Anglophone corporations, and so their chairman, must act unethically. Let's look at slide number 10, which shows the ethical standards of a court of law. It is unconscionable for the judge to be influenced in any way by the accused. It's just not acceptable. The judge would dismiss himself if the accused had any power over him. But if we move on to slide number 11 and see what happens in commerce, we see that the judge, who's now called the auditor, he has to give an opinion and judge the director's accounts. And guess who nominates, selects, and pays and controls the judge? The directors. This is unconscionable unethically. And yet it's not mentioned in any corporate governance code, stock exchange listing requirement. It's the elephant in the room, but nobody wants to see this inconvenient truth. Now, if we go back to the next slide, number 12, you'll note that in the middle there's the stakeholder congress. And it's the Congress that appoints the chair of the shareholders' annual general meeting. You say, why does there's two reasons for this. One is to avoid the unethical conflicts of a governor or director controlling the process of their election, appointment, and remuneration. And the more important reason is it gives stakeholders power over the management board and the governance board to take notice of what they wishes and how they want to be protected. But even if we had all corporations in a nation state becoming ecological corporations and stakeholder control with distributed intelligence and distributed control, it still would not make a significant effort, I believe, in mediating climate change. For that, we need a new monetary system. We need ecological money. All modern money today cannot be defined in any specific goods or services. It's a social construct, and it has this bizarre property of increasing in value as a clock tick, firm interest. And if you look at the cost of investing in renewable energy, as shown in slide number 13, you'll see that renewable energy typically costs 3 times as much as generating electricity from burning carbon. So the interest cost of renewable energy is 3 times as much as burning carbon. If you had cost-carrying money or negative interest rate money that was widely used during the Great Depression, privately issued, it would make renewable energy cheaper than burning carbon. So by changing the nature of the monetary system, of having ecological money, you'd eliminate the need for carbon taxing or trading. I see my 10 minutes is almost up, and I very much look forward to getting your feedback on these ideas if this is possible through the Skype connection. I thank you.